Okay, since we are not going to be able to be in class today, we're going to try to do this video this lecture via video. So get out your Chapter 9 PowerPoints, which is the chapter on homelessness, and we'll start there. So if you'll notice that the first question I ask is for you to describe homelessness. Who's homeless? You know, oftentimes we get the pictures or we say things like, you know, it's the derelict. You know, sometimes if you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see faces like this. You know, the sign says, "Please help, homeless vet." You know, but also children, you know, are homeless. You see families oftentimes that are homeless. This is a family that looks like they're living in their car. A young person, someone in their 20s, a mother with a child, you know, a man who's in his 40s. And actually, I put this up because this was actually, and some of you may have actually heard this story. It's a man they dubbed as the man with the golden voice. He was a homeless guy. He was panhandling. And one of the local TV guys, you know, came up and, you know, said, "Hey, give us your voice." And so he did a recording. People heard it. It was on YouTube. It went viral. And people kind of gave this guy a chance. He talks about his struggle with drugs and alcohol addiction. He lost everything. He lost his wife. He lost his children. He lost, of course, his job. He became homeless, and he kind of spiraled into homelessness and addiction. But he was also given an opportunity to work again. Sorry, guys. So you can see that the face of homelessness basically is anyone, and it can be any of us. The thing about homelessness is there's no standard definition. For example, if you work with children, there are definitions for homelessness that describe a child who is, you know, a family member who's bunked up with another family member. But when you start talking about a federal definition or a definition that includes everyone, you really can't find one, or one that even everyone agrees upon. HUD probably comes the closest, but you know, there are also some problems with definitions with HUD housing, because it does not include individuals who are in doubled up with other family members, or who are in hotels. They are not considered homeless. So sometimes they're not able to benefit from some of the programs that receive HUD funding. How you define something actually impacts how you collect information on it, and in turn it affects the policy as well as the funding for that. When we talk about trying to define homelessness, in 1987 there was an attempt to define homelessness as an individual who lacks a fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence, an individual who has a primary nighttime residence that is supervised publicly or privately, such as an operated shelter designed to provide temporary living accommodation, which that includes welfare hotels, congregate shelters, as well as transitional housing for the mentally ill. It's an institution that provides a temporary residence for individuals intended to be institutionalized, or publicly or private place that is not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings. That's the U.S. Code from 2005. It includes a lot of different things, but the problem with this definition is that it fails to recognize the hidden homeless. Those who are living in motels and automobiles and abandoned buildings, or those who are doubled up with other family members or friends. It also doesn't take into account those who do not want to be counted. And there are those who don't want to be counted as part of the homeless. Sometimes students have difficulty understanding that, but think about it. If you reside in a shelter, are you going to share that with your friends? If you are camping in your mother's backyard? Are you going to let your friends know that? So it's very, very common for those who are homeless. They might not share that with others. So do not want to be counted as the homeless. So sometimes it's very difficult to get an accurate count of who is actually homeless. It also doesn't reflect the transient nature of homelessness, which also makes it difficult to count. There are some who suggest that we actually have different categories or classifications of homelessness. For example, the near homeless, the homeless children, homeless vets, homeless families, homeless single people, those who are within a week of homelessness, those kinds of things. There's also kind of a negative attitude toward the homeless. If you think back to what we've talked about earlier in this course, when we talked about the beginning of social services, we talked about how we have kind of gone through an evolution of our responsibility for those who are less fortunate. Now we're caught in a cycle where there's a very negative attitude toward anyone who's poor, anyone who's homeless, anyone who isn't able to partake of society in all of its so there's a negative attitude to those who cannot participate in society to the fullest extent. There have been several surveys that have repeatedly tried to identify attitudes and beliefs about the homelessness, and the things that come up often are they are lazy, they're to blame for their own problems, they believe that they're receiving services or assistance, and that they're being dishonest about what kinds of services they might be receiving or what kind of funding they might be receiving. And some of the surveys have also shown that the attitude is that some people believe that they are actually receiving more benefits than they deserve. It's important to identify and refute our own biases and stereotypes toward this issue. And I always use an example in my own life about when I was working for a large corporation in southern Florida. And I would drive to work every day, and I would pass by this park. And I sometimes would try to avoid this park because it was southern Florida, so therefore there were many people who were in the parks, who were sleeping in the parks. They were obviously homeless because I would drive by at night. They would be there, drive by early in the morning. There would be people sleeping on benches and that sort of thing. And sometimes I would try to avoid it because I felt like it was dangerous. They were scary. I just didn't understand it. And the thing that caused me to kind of change my attitude about the individuals who were living there was one morning I was driving to work. I had to drive by the park, and I saw this man whom I had seen several times in the park who was trying to get water out of one of the sprinkler systems. It was an automatic sprinkler that would go off at different intervals. He had a cup and he had a toothbrush. And he was trying to get ready for the day by catching water in this cup and brushing his teeth. And at that moment, it humanized him for me. And I can't think about that particular situation without becoming somewhat emotional because I'm embarrassed by my own biases. I felt like the homeless were scary. I felt like they were dirty. They were nasty. They probably were mentally ill. Maybe they were criminals, axe murderers, whatever. But in that one instant, which didn't last very long, I was driving by in a car and he was trying to collect water to brush his teeth. I realized that he was trying to get ready for his day just like I had been trying to get ready for my day. So it caused me to look at the homeless just a little bit differently and caused me to examine my own biases and my own stereotypes about the homeless and the causes of homelessness. Some of the reasons for homelessness are things that we might not have thought about before. There are many times a shortage of affordable housing. Whenever we see programs that are going through older neighborhoods, tearing down what we consider dilapidated buildings, or to make room for a brand new high-rise or a brand new office building or something like that, it's oftentimes destroying affordable living for individuals who cannot afford to live other places. So whenever we see those gentrification programs or those urban renewal types of programs, and they're destroying homes, we need to think about, where are these people going to live? Because the rent was very cheap. Just in our own community, if you think about the controversy and the the joy or celebration about the new medical school coming to the downtown area. We're very excited about the medical school, but because the medical school is coming to town, one of the businesses is relocating farther away from the downtown corridor and closer to Highway 41. And if you drive by Highway 41, you're going to see where they have taken down a lot of older, smaller homes. These homes were probably built in the 20s, 30s, maybe even up to the 40s, but they have all been destroyed. They've all been razed for the building of this business that was located downtown. The thing about that is, a lot of these homes were rental houses, and they were rented for fairly inexpensively for a house in this community. So we lost about 350 or 400 houses that were affordable for a lot of people. So that's just an illustration in our own community about how urban renewal can impact individuals who are near homeless or who are living from paycheck to paycheck. Another thing that can impact individuals who are nearly homeless or near homeless is changes in the workforce due to technology. Individuals who oftentimes struggle financially struggle due to lack of marketable skills. And so when jobs are taken away that can be replaced by technology, then oftentimes individuals who rely on these jobs lose their ability to support themselves. I know it doesn't have anything to do with the general scheme of things, but I have to tell you, I will not go through a self-check at the grocery store or at the hardware store or wherever, because that's someone's job, and someone needs that job. So think about that the next time you go through the self-checkout line. Other things that impact homelessness or can cause homelessness are undereducation or lack of education, discrimination and oppression within our society, a lack of support from family or friends, physical illnesses, mental illnesses, and other kinds of disabilities, as well as substance abuse. History of trauma can impact or cause homelessness. And that history of trauma can either be from childhood or can also be as a result of domestic violence. Individuals who've been incarcerated have an increasingly difficult time trying to find employment. In this particular state, it's very, very difficult for an individual who has a felony record to find suitable employment to be able to support themselves or support a family. As well as things that impact homelessness are natural disasters. Think about Katrina, and think about the individuals who were dislocated because of Katrina. That's been, 6-7 years ago now, and you still have individuals who are living places that they would not normally live because their homes were destroyed because of Katrina. Wars also can cause homelessness. Not so much in this country right now, but if you look at Europe, you see a lot of people who are refugees because they are fleeing places like Somalia, the Middle East, and they're fleeing to other areas, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates. because of wars. So war can also cause homelessness. Sometimes we think about homelessness as a modern problem, but it isn't. Since there have been established residential settlements, there have been those within the population that either by choice or by life circumstances have been homeless. Now, remember from our earlier chapters when we talked about our societal response to helping those who could not help themselves, we have gone through an evolution of what our responsibility to those who are less fortunate are. Early times, it was thought that we all had responsibility for our brothers and sisters. Then, as time passed, and social Darwinism took place. There was blaming the victim came about. So, even though since time began and there have been residential settlements, and there have always been those within those society who either by choice or by chance were homeless, the community, the village, the society's response to those individuals has changed over time. The type of people who've experienced homelessness and the reasons for their misfortune have changed dramatically throughout the years. When we think about homelessness, oftentimes we think about the vagrant, the alcoholic, a dirty man in his 40s who just basically drank himself into homelessness. But the face of homelessness has changed somewhat, especially in recent times. And we see more and more children who are becoming homeless. And actually, if we think about when we begin to start seeing homelessness as our problem again, rather than the problem of the individual, it was probably the Great Depression that actually caused us to rethink our attitudes about that. The Great Depression brought people back to kind of a pre-Protestant ethic time, and they began to recognize that poverty and homelessness could be caused by circumstances rather than an individual. For example, none of us can prevent catastrophic bank failure, and it wasn't through any fault of our own that brought about the Great Depression. So with the Great Depression, people began to realize that rather than blaming the victim for their circumstance, that sometimes societal issues cause problems that are beyond their control. The Great Depression reminded us that that sometimes, no matter how hard one works, circumstances occur that can render someone destitute and impoverished. It's because of the Great Depression that we saw so many social changes take place from 1935 into the 40s, not so much in the 50s because we were fairly stable during that time. Not to say that there were not social problems, there were, but the country's response to them kind of waned during the 50s. Now, during the 60s, we began to see a lot of social change and demand for social change. So also during the 60s, we began to see programs to help those who were not able to take part of society. Johnson's War on Poverty and all the social welfare programs that came about because of the War on Poverty are part of that. And we've talked a lot about those in previous chapters, and we'll continue to talk about those programs in the future. Many times we began to see, we thought that single men, alcoholics, vagrants, addicts, bums were the ones that were homeless. And those still do exist so it's not that they've gone away by any stretch of the imagination. But that population is quickly becoming a minority as far as the homeless population is concerned. The fastest growing group among homelessness are homeless families, especially single-parent families. Approximately women around the age of 25, families with small children, approximately 2 to 3 kids, in the preschool to 6 years of age range. There was a study in 1999 that found that of all homeless families, 80% were headed by single parents. And of that 80%, 95% were headed by single females. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there's definitely a feminization of poverty. It tells us that many single female-headed households with young children are homeless because 95% of all single families in shelters were headed by women, single women. Most have very tenuous housing records even prior to becoming homeless. So while they're counted at the shelter, it's actually been going on for years prior to that when they actually become homeless. So they might be living with family, they might be living with friends, moving in with, in situations where they probably are not the safest, where their children might not be thriving as well. So just because it's like, oh, well, that's just a small percentage, but before they get to that point, many have had difficulty staying housed prior to that. When we think about shelters, oftentimes we think, well, that people can always go to a shelter and that way they won't be homeless. At least they'll be out of the weather. But we need to think about the impact that living in a shelter, a communal shelter, has on the function and the relationships of a family. Think about the difficulties that kids have regarding school performance if they're living in a shelter. Shelters are typically not located in areas of town, where you might go to school. So children oftentimes have to change schools mid-year or whenever they become homeless, go to a new school where they don't know anyone. And then shelters are also temporary places. People don't live there for long periods of time. So a child might have to change schools 2 or 3 different times in the course of a school year, which that negatively impacts their ability to perform well in any situation. So oftentimes children who've experienced homelessness also oftentimes experience lower test scores, lower grades. Sometimes they often fall behind in school. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a teacher at a shelter. She's employed by the school corporation, but her classroom is at the homeless shelter. She primarily works from like 2 in the afternoon until 6 o'clock at night, working with the children after they come home from traditional school to help with homework, to help them catch up with some of the skills that they might not have picked up along the way. And one of the things she said children who experience homelessness are oftentimes 2 to 3 years behind their friends who have not experienced homelessness. So if we think about some of the causes of homelessness, we talked about being undereducated or uneducated. You can see how easily it would be to slip into a cycle where a child might not excel and might not do well in school because of homelessness of his or her parents. He or she might continue to fall behind. As if a child falls behind in school, they're more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to get into have negative consequences due to their lack of achieving in school and that sort of thing. So you can see that it's not a huge leap to see children who are underperforming because their parents' homelessness also be at risk at homelessness themselves as they grow up. When we think about the rules in the shelter, think about how difficult it might be to be a parent, to parent a child who is also being told how they can live and what they can do, how long they can stay, what the rules are, what curfew is, who can be in the room, who cannot be in the room. Think about if you have a couple of children that are school age, maybe 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, and as a single parent, you go into a shelter. If you have a teenage son who's 13, 14, 15, he may not be allowed to stay with the women or with his mother. Some shelters have rules against any male over the age of, pick a number, 12 or 13, staying in a women and children's shelter. So you can see that that can cause problems as well. Where does he go? Some shelters are beginning to be more aware of these things and working on family shelters, and we certainly need more of those in this community. We'll talk about some of the changes that some of the shelters have gone through recently to try to accommodate families in this region. Every shelter in this particular community has gone to, they have undergone looking at their policies and how their policies impact families. For example, the YWCA domestic violence program just began to admit males who had also experienced domestic violence. One of my students who's an intern at the shelter right now said, we have our first male resident. And the big concern from faculty, or not faculty, but from staff, is how will male residents be treated by the female residents who've also experienced domestic violence? And the intern says, surprisingly, they have actually been very supportive of the man who is at the shelter right now. Other shelters who are beginning to change their policies toward accepting men or that sort of thing are like Albion, Goodwill Family Center, who accepts families, any family, in their transitional housing program and their shelter program. So at least in this community, they're beginning to look at how they serve the homeless population and how they try to keep families together. So we're a long way from having the answers, but we're at least beginning to look at some of the issues that impact students or impact schools, rather impact individuals who are homeless. Another factor that we need to take a look at is runaway youth. Now, there have always been runaways since time began. There have been children or teenagers who didn't like the rules, who would run off and join the Wild Bill West show or whatever. But what we see oftentimes are youth who are not treated well at home, oftentimes, who are runaways. Not simply just because, they want to do what they want to do when they want to do it, but oftentimes children will run away or teenagers will run away because there might be problems at home with abuse or neglect. Sometimes they have substance abuse issues themselves, or their parents have substance abuse issues. We often see parents who kick students or kick children out of their home once they turn 18. We also see youth that are homeless because they have aged out of the foster care system. I was talking to a colleague of mine who works in a men's shelter, and she says they are seeing younger and younger young men, like 18, 19, 20-year-olds in the shelter. 5 years ago, they didn't see that. So they're seeing younger and younger people going into the shelters. They are going into the shelters with more difficulties or more problems than they did also 5 years ago. They are beginning to see more drug abuse, hard drugs. Heroin's beginning to make kind of a comeback as far as the street drugs, and so they're seeing more problems, or younger people with more difficult problems coming into the shelters. Youth are also at a significant increase for risk for drug use, as well as risk for the sex trade and for criminal activity. Oftentimes they are targeted for prostitution at a very young age because they're very vulnerable. There's no one to speak up for them. There's no one to take care of them. Youth on the street oftentimes fall victim to those who were going to exploit them for criminal activity, for the sex trade and this sort of thing, because there's no one to speak for them. It can be a very difficult group to reach because they tend to be very suspicious of adults anyway. And they also tend to work very hard at keeping hidden. So, trying to engage a runaway youth is very difficult. It's not that it can't be done. It just takes time to build a rapport and to work with individuals who are on the street. A population that we really haven't talked a lot about when we talk about social problems is the problem that older people experience. And we're actually beginning to see more and more seniors that are having difficulty with permanent housing. And we are going to continue to see this population because we have more and more baby boomers who are entering into the population of senior citizen. The primary root cause of homelessness among older people is financial problems. As people age and as they have inadequate retirement savings, we're going to see more problems with housing. Medical care oftentimes exceeds an individual's ability to pay for it. There's also a high cost of housing. As you get older, if you own your own home, it's more difficult to make those repairs to the house. So oftentimes a house that maybe 20, 30 years ago was habitable because of the lack of physical ability to make repairs to a home, and also lack of income to make repairs. We see individuals who are older having difficulty remaining in their own homes. Seniors have difficulty finding employment because of ages and because of discrimination about their age. It's not that you can't continue to work into your 70s. It's people don't think you can work into your 70s. Sometimes physical problems manifest themselves as people age. If you don't believe that, ask anyone who used to play sports in their 40s or 50s. You'll see athletes talk about arthritis or joint pain because of old injuries, and these were individuals that were in peak physical condition at one time. So physical problems can cause people not to be able to work in the type of job that they were accustomed to working in when they were younger. Mental health issues can also be a factor, as well as other kinds of disabilities. So senior citizens also suffer from an increased physical and psychological vulnerability, which can lead them susceptible to physical and financial victimization. When we talk about financial victimization of senior citizens, we think about the stranger who is trying to scam them out of some money or something like that. But actually, when we're talking about financial abuse of seniors, oftentimes it is a family member who is victimizing that person. It's very difficult to catch this because oftentimes there's also